Row 32 was the airline's last stop, a place reserved for the most forgettable passengers. Cramped seats squeezed between the restrooms and galley, where legroom was non-existent and dignity often slipped away unnoticed. That's where Manuel Santos sat, wedged between a businessman hogging both armrests and a college student whose glare said everything about her annoyance. Manuel said nothing. He made no complaints and asked for nothing. At 73, he had learned the hard way that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially over something as trivial as airplane seats. He simply endured, blending into the background as the flight prepared to take off. But during the routine safety briefing, everything changed. Captain Williams was midway through his standard announcements when his eyes locked on the weathered face in seat 32C. Suddenly, his words faltered, and the hum of the cabin faded into silence. Without a word, the captain set down his microphone, rose from the cockpit, and walked slowly down the aisle. He knelt beside the man everyone had dismissed as invisible. What he said next transformed a routine flight into a moment that every passenger would carry with them forever. Welcome to Echoes of Honor, where we discover that heroes often sit in the worst seats, asking for nothing while deserving everything. Before we continue this incredible story about sacrifice, courage, and the veterans we overlook every day, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe these stories of human courage and quiet heroism need to be shared with the world, please hit that subscribe button to join our growing community. Your support helps us bring these powerful moments to light. Delta Flight 847 from Los Angeles to Miami was a red-eye flight, filled with the usual collection of weary travelers trying to cross the country while they slept. The Boeing 757 hummed with the subdued energy of passengers settling in for a long journey, most of them already absorbed in their phones, tablets, or the complex logistics of getting comfortable in cramped airline seats. The aircraft was full, which meant that every seat was occupied and overhead bin space was at a premium. First-class passengers had already settled into their spacious accommodations with pre-flight beverages and the kind of attentive service that came with premium ticket prices. Business travelers in the forward economy section claimed armrests and positioned their laptops for maximum productivity. Everyone else made the best of whatever space remained. Manuel Santos had been assigned seat 32C through no choice of his own. When he had arrived at the gate, the airline representative had apologetically explained that due to a last-minute aircraft change, his original seat was no longer available. The only remaining option was a middle seat in the last row, sandwiched between strangers who would probably resent his presence for the entire 5-hour flight. Manuel had accepted the assignment without complaint, just as he had accepted most of the disappointments and indignities that had accumulated over his 73 years. He was accustomed to being overlooked, to being treated as if his comfort didn't matter, to occupying whatever space others were willing to grant him. His simple clothes, a faded polo shirt, khaki pants, and worn sneakers, marked him as someone traveling on a budget, probably visiting family or attending a medical appointment. To his fellow passengers, Manuel appeared to be exactly what he seemed, an elderly man traveling alone, moving slowly, speaking quietly, taking up space that more important people could have used more effectively. The businessman to his left had immediately spread his materials across both armrests, making it clear that Manuel's presence was an unwelcome intrusion. The college student to his right had positioned her backpack to claim as much territory as possible, her body language radiating annoyance at having to share space with someone she clearly considered beneath her notice. What none of them could see, what Manuel carried invisible in his heart and mind, was a story that would have humbled every person on that aircraft. In his shirt pocket was a small, worn photograph, 47 faces looking back at the camera with the grateful smiles of people who had been given a second chance at life. Civilians whose names Manuel had memorized, whose families he had protected, whose survival had come at a cost that most people couldn't imagine. The photograph had been taken in 1987, 6 months after Manuel's release from a prisoner of war camp in Central America. It showed the 47 civilians he had kept alive during 8 months of captivity, 8 months when he had chosen their survival over his own freedom, their safety over his own comfort, their hope over his own despair. Manuel's story began in El Salvador, where he had been serving as a helicopter crew chief during a civilian evacuation mission. When their aircraft was shot down near a refugee camp, Manuel had survived the crash along with 47 innocent people, men, women, and children who were trying to escape the violence that had consumed their homeland. With the helicopter destroyed and enemy forces closing in, Manuel had made a decision that would define the rest of his life. As the boarding process continued around him, Manuel sat quietly in his cramped middle seat, trying to make himself as small as possible to avoid disturbing his obviously irritated seatmates. The businessman was already engrossed in spreadsheets on his laptop, occasionally glancing at Manuel with the kind of impatience that suggested elderly passengers were a personal inconvenience. The college student was scrolling through social media, her earbuds blocking out the world while her body language made it clear that Manuel's presence was ruining her travel experience. Other passengers throughout the aircraft were settling into their own versions of the modern air travel experience. Premium passengers were already enjoying complimentary beverages and the kind of personal attention that came with higher-priced tickets. Families were struggling to entertain children during the boarding delays. Business travelers were calculating the impact of any potential departure delays on their carefully scheduled meetings and connections. Manuel observed it all with the quiet attention of someone who had learned to read people and situations carefully. His trained eye automatically noted the location of emergency exits, the behavior of the flight crew, the overall mood of the passengers around him. These habits had been developed during 26 years of military service, reinforced during 8 months of captivity, and maintained throughout the decades of civilian life that followed. The flight attendants moved efficiently through their pre-flight preparations, conducting safety checks and ensuring that passengers were properly seated and secured. Their interactions with passengers varied based on seat class and apparent status. Warm and attentive with first-class travelers, professionally courteous with business passengers, and functionally efficient with everyone else. When the safety briefing began, Manuel listened carefully despite having heard similar presentations thousands of times during his frequent travel to visit children and grandchildren scattered across the country. He had learned during his military service that safety procedures were serious business, that the difference between life and death often came down to preparation, training, and the kind of attention to detail that most people considered unnecessary. Captain David Williams was conducting the briefing from the front of the aircraft, going through the standard announcements about seat belts, emergency exits, and oxygen masks with the practiced efficiency of someone who had delivered the same information thousands of times. His voice carried the calm authority of an experienced pilot, providing reassurance to nervous passengers while conveying important safety information to everyone aboard. But as Captain Williams's eyes swept across the cabin during his presentation, they fell on the weathered face of the man in seat 32C, and something extraordinary happened. Recognition hit him like a physical blow, stopping his words mid-sentence and causing him to stare in disbelief at a face he had seen before in photographs, in military records, and in the kind of documentation that accompanied stories of extraordinary heroism. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Captain Williams tried to process what he was seeing. Passengers began to look around nervously, wondering why the safety briefing had suddenly stopped, why their pilot was standing frozen at the front of the cabin with an expression of shock and recognition on his face. Manuel noticed the pilot's reaction but didn't understand its significance. He had grown accustomed to being invisible, to passing through the world without being recognized or remembered. The idea that this airline captain might know who he was seemed impossible, given how carefully Manuel had maintained his privacy in the decades since his military service ended. Captain Williams had spent 15 years flying commercial aircraft, but before that he had served 8 years as a military pilot, and before that he had been a young officer who had studied case histories of extraordinary heroism as part of his leadership training. Manuel Santos wasn't just a name in those files. He was a legend, a story that had been told and retold as an example of the kind of courage and sacrifice that defined the very best of military service. Captain Williams's mind flooded with details he had memorized from Manuel's military records, details that had shaped his own understanding of leadership, sacrifice, and moral courage. Staff Sergeant Manuel Santos, helicopter crew chief, who had been shot down during a civilian evacuation mission in El Salvador in 1987. who had survived the crash with 47 innocent civilians, who had chosen to stay with them when he could have attempted to escape alone. The enemy forces had offered to release Manuel multiple times in exchange for information about American military operations. Each time, he had refused, knowing that his freedom might mean death for the civilians he was protecting. For 8 months, he had organized their hiding places, rationed their meager food and water, treated their injuries with whatever medical supplies he could find, and maintained their hope when they had every reason to despair. Manuel had endured interrogation, torture, and psychological warfare, all while keeping 47 strangers alive through the sheer force of his will and the strength of his character. He had told them stories to distract them from their fear, had shared his own food rations with children who were hungry, had held elderly refugees when they cried, and had never once expressed regret for his decision to stay. When international pressure finally secured their release 8 months later, Manuel had been hospitalized for weeks due to malnutrition and injuries sustained during captivity. The civilians he had protected had gone on to rebuild their lives in safety, many of them eventually immigrating to the United States where they had raised families, started businesses, and contributed to their communities. But Manuel had never sought recognition for his sacrifice. He had returned to duty after his recovery, had completed his military service with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized his entire career, and had retired to civilian life, where he worked as a maintenance supervisor at a community college until his own retirement 5 years earlier. Captain Williams knew all of this because Manuel's story had been featured in the military leadership course he had taken as a young officer. The case study had been titled Moral Courage Under Extreme Conditions, and it had used Manuel's 8 months of captivity as an example of the kind of character that separated true leaders from those who simply held rank. Now, seeing Manuel squeezed into the worst seat on his aircraft, treated as if he were just another elderly passenger taking up space, Captain Williams felt a profound sense of injustice mixed with overwhelming respect. Without hesitation, he set down his microphone and began walking down the aisle toward row 32. Passengers watched with growing confusion as their captain abandoned his position at the front of the aircraft and moved through the cabin with obvious purpose. Some assumed there was a security issue that required his personal attention. Others thought there might be a medical emergency involving one of the passengers. None of them imagined that they were about to witness a moment of recognition that would transform their understanding of heroism and sacrifice. When Captain Williams reached row 32, he knelt beside Manuel's seat, his voice carrying clearly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Staff Sergeant Santos, I'm Captain Williams. Sir, I studied your service record in my military leadership training. What you did in El Salvador, keeping those 47 people alive for 8 months, it's taught to every officer as an example of the highest form of moral courage." Manuel's weathered face showed surprise and then a kind of quiet recognition. He had spent decades trying to fade into anonymity, to live a normal civilian life without constant reminders of those 8 months that had tested every aspect of his character and strength. "Captain, that was a long time ago," Manuel said quietly, his voice carrying the humility that had marked his entire life. "I just did what anyone would have done in the same situation." Captain Williams's response carried the weight of professional knowledge and personal admiration. "Sir, with respect, that's not true. Most people would have tried to escape alone, would have prioritized their own survival over the lives of strangers. You chose to stay. You chose to endure 8 months of captivity so that 47 innocent people could eventually return to their families." The conversation between Captain Williams and Manuel had attracted the attention of passengers throughout the cabin, and word began to spread that something extraordinary was happening in row 32. The businessman who had claimed both armrests suddenly felt ashamed of his selfishness. The college student who had made her annoyance obvious realized she had been dismissive of someone whose courage far exceeded anything she had ever demonstrated. Captain Williams stood and addressed the entire cabin, his voice carrying the respect and gravity that Manuel's story deserved. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet Staff Sergeant Manuel Santos. In 1987, his helicopter was shot down while evacuating civilians from a war zone in El Salvador. Sergeant Santos survived the crash with 47 innocent people, men, women, and children who were trying to escape violence and find safety. The aircraft fell completely silent as passengers processed this information. Many had never heard a story of such extraordinary sacrifice, had never been in the presence of someone who had chosen the welfare of strangers over his own freedom and safety. Captain Williams continued, his voice carrying genuine emotion. When enemy forces offered to release Sergeant Santos in exchange for military information, he refused. Not once, but repeatedly over 8 months of captivity. He chose to stay with those 47 civilians, protecting them, keeping them alive, and giving them hope when they had every reason to despair. The impact of the captain's words rippled through the aircraft like a revelation. Passengers who had been absorbed in their own concerns suddenly found themselves confronted with a story of sacrifice that put their daily problems into perspective. The businessman worried about his presentations realized that his professional challenges were insignificant compared to what Manuel had endured. The college student concerned about her grades understood that her academic stress couldn't compare to the life-and-death decisions Manuel had faced every day for 8 months. Sergeant Santos endured torture and interrogation so that 47 strangers could eventually return to their families, Captain Williams said, his voice carrying the kind of respect that made every passenger understand they were in the presence of genuine heroism. When they were finally rescued, those civilians had survived because one man decided that their lives were worth any sacrifice he might have to make. Without being asked or organized, passengers throughout the aircraft began to stand. It started with a veteran in row 15 who recognized the significance of what they were hearing. Then an elderly woman who remembered the Central American conflicts of the 1980s. Within minutes, every passenger on the aircraft was standing in silent tribute to the man in seat 32C. Manuel accepted the recognition with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his life, but those who watched carefully could see that the acknowledgement meant more to him than he would ever admit. For decades, he had carried the weight of those 8 months alone, had lived with memories that most people couldn't imagine, had wondered if his sacrifice had really mattered in the larger scheme of things. Captain Williams made a decision that was unprecedented in his 15 years of commercial flying. Sergeant Santos, would you do me the honor of joining me in the cockpit for the remainder of this flight? It would be a privilege to have you there. As Manuel rose from his cramped middle seat, passengers began to applaud. Not the polite, obligatory applause that sometimes follows announcements, but genuine appreciation for witnessing something extraordinary. The businessman who had grudged him armrest space immediately offered to help him gather his belongings. The college student who had shown her annoyance apologized for her behavior and thanked him for his service. The walk from row 32 to the cockpit became a journey of recognition and respect. Every passenger Manuel passed stood to acknowledge him, many reaching out to shake his hand or express their gratitude. Flight attendants who had barely noticed him during boarding now watched with tears in their eyes as they realized they had been serving someone whose courage far exceeded anything they had ever witnessed. In the cockpit, Manuel sat quietly as Captain Williams and his first officer completed their departure preparations. The conversation during the flight revealed the full scope of Manuel's story, how he had kept the civilians organized and hopeful, how he had shared his own meager rations with children and elderly refugees, how he had created daily routines and activities to maintain morale during the long months of captivity. Manuel also learned about Captain Williams's military background and his study of Manuel's case during his officer training. The conversation was a bridge between generations of service members, connecting the wisdom of experience with the inspiration that comes from learning about true heroism. During the flight, passengers who had initially been strangers began talking to each other, sharing stories about the veterans and their own families, expressing gratitude for sacrifices they had never really considered before. The recognition of Manuel's heroism had transformed the entire atmosphere of the aircraft, reminding everyone aboard that extraordinary people walk quietly among us every day. When they landed in Miami, Manuel was the first passenger off the aircraft, but not because of any special privilege. Captain Williams had asked him to deplane first so that every other passenger could express their thanks personally. For 30 minutes, 200 people filed past Manuel Santos, shaking his hand, thanking him for his service, and telling him that his story had changed their understanding of courage and sacrifice. The 47 civilians Manuel had protected in El Salvador had gone on to live full lives, to raise families, to contribute to their communities, to experience all the ordinary joys and sorrows that make up human existence. Their children and grandchildren existed because one man had decided that their lives were worth any sacrifice he might have to make. That night, surrounded by the thanks of strangers who had been transformed by learning his story, Manuel understood that heroism isn't measured by recognition or reward. It's measured by the willingness to do what's right regardless of the cost, to protect the innocent regardless of personal risk, and to choose service over self-interest even when no one is watching. Sometimes heroism happens in a moment of crisis, when circumstances demand courage that most people didn't know they possessed. But sometimes heroism is sustained over months and years, requiring not just bravery but endurance, not just strength but compassion, not just determination but hope. Manuel Santos had demonstrated both kinds of heroism, and on a routine flight from Los Angeles to Miami, 200 strangers had been reminded that extraordinary people walk quietly among us every day, asking for nothing, deserving everything, and changing the world through acts of service that most of us will never fully understand. The middle seat in row 32 had been transformed from a symbol of neglect into a reminder that greatness often wears the most humble disguise. The pilot's announcement had become a lesson in recognizing and honoring the heroes who shape our world through quiet acts of extraordinary courage. In the weeks that followed, many passengers from Flight 847 found themselves treating elderly travelers with new respect, understanding that everyone carries invisible stories of courage, sacrifice, and significance. Manuel's example had taught them that heroism doesn't require recognition to be real, that sacrifice doesn't need applause to be meaningful, and that the most important people are often the ones we notice least. This story was brought to you by Echoes of Honor. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who sacrificed for others without expecting anything in return? Tell us in the comments about the quiet heroes in your life and how their example has influenced your own understanding of service and sacrifice. And if you think stories like these need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.